Hi there, my name's Cathi from Software Solutions, and this is one of a collection of videos that supports my Excel Level 3 data manipulation course. What I want to look at now is recording macros, which we have done. We've actually done a number of macros, quite a few macros in this course, but I just want to address the topic and summarize the topic and complete the topic. We've learnt that a macro is basically recording a series of actions and then stop recording. And then when you have to repeat that series of actions, you can just run the macro and it does it for you. So a macro is a way of automating tasks. Now, if you're serious about macros, you really need to turn on what we call the Developers tab. And it's a tab that appears in the ribbon. To do this, we go into File and we go into Options. And if you choose Customize Ribbon on the left-hand side, you've got Developers on the right-hand side. So I'm going to tick that and go OK. And now I have an extra tab in my ribbon, which will always be there, which is called the Developers tab. And on the left-hand side, it's got a lot of stuff to do with code, which basically means macros. Now, the first thing I want to highlight is once you've got the Developer tab up, choose Macro Security. You have to choose a macro security level that you can work with. For example, I would discourage you from using disable macros without notification. That means none of your macros will work and you won't even be notified. None of them will work. I always enable my macros because I work with them so much. But that is something that you need to decide what you're going to do as far as your macro security goes. The other thing we've learned along the way is that if you do have an Excel file with macros and you want to be able to keep those macros, you have to save the file as a macro-enabled workbook. Only a macro-enabled workbook can hold macros, not an Excel workbook. So make sure you save it as a macro-enabled workbook. We've also learned that as far as recording a macro, we could use this record macro button on the Developers tab, but we didn't have that up till now. So what we did is we right-clicked the status bar and we turned on macro recording. And by turning that on, we have access to this button, which is a little square in a circle, which allows us to record a macro easily from anywhere. So that's the easiest way to record a macro, though you do have this option now as well. When it comes to recording a macro, let's have a look. I'm going to insert a new sheet and I'm going to call it macros. Okay, let's look at just recording a simple macro. So as far as recording a macro, I'm just going to hit the little square here. I'm going to call it address and I'm going to call it absolute. And okay. All right. So now I want to record clicking, say, maybe on D4 and typing Software Solutions. So it records me typing. You don't have to go fast because it'll play back fast. You just take your time. But your actions have to be deliberate and with intent. In the next cell down, I'm just going to say Pies Pa, next cell down Tauranga, next cell down New Zealand. So that's what I want my macro to record, and then I'll just go back up to the beginning, D4, and I'll adjust the column width. That's my macro, so I stop recording. Now, when I go to run the macro, I've got the macros button here. The macros button here lets me see my macro, lets me delete it, lets me run it. So if I run it, I just did it. But I didn't see anything happening. And that is because this macro records going to D4. And it just overwrites those cells. If I maybe deleted these and then ran it, goes to D4 and puts the address in. But what if I want the address over here, or I want the address over here? I want to relatively put the address wherever I happen to be sitting, not always in D4. Then I need to turn on Use Relative References. Now you can turn this on before you record the macro or while you're recording the macro. So let's say I go to G4 and I go record macro, address, and relative. And okay. Now turn on Use Relative. So in the active cell, I will type Software Solutions. Then it will relatively go down a cell. And it's recording relatively moving. And then stop recording. So Now if I click over here and I go to macros and I run the relative macro, it will put it over here. If I go over here and run the macro again, relative, run, it'll put it over here. But if I go over here and I run the macro absolute, it will always go over to there. So use relative references is something you can turn on before you record, turn on or off after you record, or turn on and off as you record, depending on what you want your macro to do. If I want to look at the code, I go to my macros button. I might stick with absolute and I'll choose edit. So we can run, we can delete, or we can edit. If I look at the code, this macro says go to D4, go to D5, go to D6, go to D7, go back to D4. So that's the absolute. Puts an address in D4 downwards. That's what that does. Whereas this one puts an address and then offsets by one row, offset, offset, offset. So this is a relative, puts an address in any cell relatively. So you can edit your macros, and we've looked at doing that, and we've created these earlier macros. These macros are in module 1 of the Excel 3-2 file. But if I went to the module for Excel 3-1, there's the 2 macros we created in the Excel 3-1 file. And if I double click this module, this has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sub-procedures, 8 macros in it. Also available in this list here. You can choose the macros that you want to look at. So this is your Visual Basic Editor, or your VBE. Your code is written in a language called VBA. I can exit out of there and return to my Excel and save my file. And that explains the buttons in this group. There's the Visual Basic button, takes you straight back to there. The macros button lets you, yes, delete a macro, run a macro, edit a macro, even lets you assign. If I want to assign a shortcut key to this one, I can go to options and assign a shortcut key to a macro after I've recorded it, and assign a description to a macro after I've recorded it. So that's handy as well, and that's what that options button does. And I'll just cancel. When we create a macro, we looked at there's a variety of ways that we can run it. Let's take the address relative example. One way that we can run a macro is using a shape or a picture or an object. So I can go to insert shapes, for example, any object, choose maybe a rounded rectangle, drag it out and say click to insert address. I can then size it, move it, whatever I want to do. But ultimately, if you've got a picture, a shape, an object, you can right click it and you can assign a macro. If you can right click it, you can assign a macro to it. And I choose address relative and OK. And it means I can be sitting in a cell and click that button. Sit in a cell and click that button, and it inserts the address. So a shape or an object, if you can right click it, that's one way of running a macro. The other way of running a macro is a shortcut key. So if I go to developer, macros, address relative, options, I can assign maybe Shift R. So Control Shift R puts in a relative address. Okay, cancel. So if I click here and go Control Shift R, or click here and go Control Shift R, it will insert the address, it will run. So you can run a macro using a shortcut key. You can run a macro using a shape or an object. The third way you can run a macro is if you add it to the quick access toolbar, which we looked at earlier when we made these macros in an earlier video. So I'm going to hit this drop down and go into more commands. I'm going to say this is just for this file, and I want to look at macros, and I want my relative address to be added, and there it is there. I'll modify it and say insert address relatively, and then I might just choose maybe a little house, and OK, and OK. So this button here on my quick access toolbar inserts the address relatively. In fact, I should go back to more commands, back to that file, and back to modify and mention in brackets that the shortcut key is Control-Shift-R. And okay, just like we did with these other ones we made in an earlier video. If you've got time, go back and look at the earlier videos. You'll see how these macros were made. And okay, so now I can click on a cell and hit this button, and it just inserts my address relatively. So you can have a shortcut key, you can have a button on your quick access toolbar, you can even have a shape or a picture. Lots of different ways that you can actually run a macro. And there are other ways as well, but you'll need to do the level 6 course called Macros and VBA. You can go from this level 3 course straight to level 6. You don't have to do level 4 and 5, and we'll get stuck into macros and VBA and really what you can do with code. Other macros that you can practice with are chart data, blanks, chart, and values. Let's just take blanks for example. In your notes, I asked you to create a macro that fills the blanks with zeros. So the macro itself doesn't select the cells. The macro itself works with cells that have already been selected. So I'm going to select this range, Control A. I'm going to record a macro, just call it blanks. And I'm going to assign the shortcut key Shift B. And I'm going to put a description. This fills a pre-selected range of cells that have blanks with zeros. And okay. So we go Control G, special, blanks, and okay to select the blank cell. We type a 0, but we don't press enter. Enter means fill in one cell. Control enter fills in all the selected cells. So at that point, I just stop recording. And so now what I want to do is delete those zeros. So I hit the delete key. I might make a couple of copies of the blank sheet just to test. If I selected this range of cells and went Control-Shift-B, it would fill those cells with blanks. If I selected the entire range and went Control-Shift-B, it would fill in the entire range with blanks. It is a good idea to make a duplicate of sheets because you can't always undo a macro, which is something we learned in earlier macros as well. I do hope that demystifies the whole topic of macros. Macros is basically recording your actions so that the next time you have to perform that task, you don't have to do it manually and spend a lot of time doing it. You just run one or more macros and they do that for you. If you want to learn more, do the level 6 course. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like or subscribe so I know whether I'm producing good stuff or not. And take care. Ka kite.